and actually get the share back going. So, right, so I'm a Bainer. I am a occupational medicine doctor and also the founder of Medic Footprints. Medic Footprint started off a few years ago by myself as an organisation that really empowered doctors in exploring a wealth of career opportunities beyond conventional medicine, as well as learning how to look after their own well-being. So over the years, we've grown our community quite substantially. So we have just over 9,000 subscribers now. And we basically fill in the gaps in your knowledge, whether it's careers, whether it's well-being, and we don't really have any boundaries as long as it's not illegal. This is basically what's really important to us, because we've realized that community amongst doctors has kind of disintegrated, especially over the last few decades, and we are experiencing quite significant issues with regards to a whole range of things, which is highlighted most frequently with what happened with the Dr. Hadiza bawa-garba, David Selu, and other high-profile cases relating to mental health and suicides amongst some doctors that are going through suspension. So I currently do some work with the Practitioner Health Programme, which is an NHS-funded programme run originally out of Vauxhall, but actually has a national programme for GPs in the UK, and they support doctors with mental health concerns. So you don't need to have a diagnosis in order to go. It's a self-referral service. It's confidential and quite oversubscribed from what I know. I've brought together today a really excellent group of panelists who will tell you their stories and why they're in the forefront of doctor suspensions, and we'll take you through some really important points on essentially covering, where is this? So we'll go through their stories. We will talk about key points on what you need to know or what you need to do for yourself, because none of us ever plans to be suspended, but it is our greatest nightmare. I can say personally, it's always been my greatest nightmare. And, I used to be a surgeon. So, there was plenty of times where I was worried about what I was doing and the outcomes of that and essentially killing people. But unfortunately, that is an outcome in what we do. Unfortunately, these kind of things have been criminalized quite substantially. So we'll go into that more later. And then what are the wellbeing issues involved? So how really to look after yourself if it happens to you. And, one of the concerns is if you are suspended, sometimes you don't get paid and that's your income gone and you've got mortgages and other commitments. So how do you get around that? And then we'll have an interactive question and answer session. So if you just familiarize yourself briefly with your menu. So there is a Q&A section. So if you have any specific questions, it's probably a bit easier to do it in the Q&A section so I can ensure that your question has been answered. Otherwise, please make sure if you've got any comments or anything, please do so in the chat box. But actually, I will just say, if you do have any specific questions for the panel, and you've already done that in the chat box, can you please copy and paste and put that in the Q&A just to make sure that we have addressed your question. Otherwise, it can be quite difficult to track. So thanks a lot for kind of complying with that. So what we'll start off with first, cool, someone's already asked the question. What we'll start off with first is a brief introduction by all our panelists as to your background and why you're at the forefront. So please keep it brief, but yeah, please welcome.
Okay, should I go first?
Oh, Tony, let's go first.
Okay, so my name's Tony Banerjee. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. So I'm a GP. I qualified about 10 years ago, and I was a GP partner and a CCG chairman when a complaint came in and I got suspended by the GMC, well, by the MPTS, which I'll come back to later. And basically, all of a sudden, everything cascades. So you lose your source of income. I was expelled by my partnership. I lost my chairmanship. There was a loophole at that time whereby the kind of CCG doesn't have to pay you when you're suspended because you stop being an independent practitioner. And then, so you know, your kind of standard of living is obviously in line with what you're earning, and I stopped earning altogether. And then I moved down to London from Yorkshire. I have been in London now for the last 4 years, and happened to join the Hurley Group as a salaried GP, and ended up working in the room next door to Claire Gerarda, who I'm sure lots of you know. She's one of the partners of Hurley Group and has done a lot of work at the RCGP and politically as well in the BMA. Yeah, so she was the founder of PHP, which is the Practitioner Health Program. And basically over a period of time, we've been talking about working together on a project like this. And we're currently trying to bring a lot of resources together to make a resource for, you know, not just suspended doctors, but for doctors who can't work, whether that be doctors who can't work because of suspension or because of emotional problems, financial problems, mental health issues, addictions. So yeah, we've got our work cut out, but I think there really is, you know, like a gap there for, you know, something like this. And that's how I've got involved with the Practitioner Health Program, and also got involved with Urbana and Medic Footprint.
Thanks a lot, Tony.
Will I go next?
Yeah.
I'm the oldest one by far, so a lot of mine's a bit historic, but nonetheless for that, I became a consultant in 1984 and was suspended peremptorily in 1995. A series of ragbag of allegations was made against me, none of which were substantiated, but it took me, myself and my privately funded legal team, 9 years to sort things out. They gave me a reference, and I then worked for 9 years in the benefits service. I could not then go back to the NHS. I was too long out of it. The Doctors Support Group helped me initially from 1997 during my suspension, and then after limited contact over a few years when I was trying to re-establish myself in a job, I then became more and more involved in the administration of the Doctor Support Group. As I think I already see some names I recognise from the Doctor Support Group. So my role there is Secretary and Treasurer, and we're also helping with the website now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Pamela. Welcome. It's very, very good to meet you as well. Jenny.
So my name's Jenny Vaughan. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm a neurologist, and I basically have become also a medical law campaigner because I led the medical side of the successful appeal for David Sellew. I've also been involved in the Hadiza bawa-garba case. I know Hadiza very well, and even before the trial, trying to support her. So a lot of what I do now is about supporting doctors who have had allegations of gross negligence manslaughter set against them. I run a website, Manslaughter and Healthcare, and actually a lot of people have contacted me through that. And it's quite clear that unfortunately a lot of these charges are being disproportionately alleged against ethnic minority doctors, and also doctors who've gone out of their way to help in overstretched circumstances, and they're often, especially Hadiza and David, they have got completely unblemished careers beforehand, and they all of a sudden find themselves being scapegoated for a tragic incident. So that's my background, and what I would bring to the table tonight is hopefully an appreciation of the criminal law in healthcare, how it's affected us. It's suddenly become very important recently, and I hope to share some of the experiences and give people some practical tips about how to basically avoid getting into court, and some of the things I've learned at first hand from both David and Hadiza about their circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Jenny. We really look forward to hearing more about your experience and working with some of these doctors. And well done for the David Sellew case, of course, and that of Hadiza. So what we're going to do first is find out more about you, who's joining us today. So why have you joined this webinar? So we've got several options. You can choose more than one. So please let us know, just so we can ensure that we're targeting our conversation at the right group of people. Let us know why you joined this webinar. So I'm just launching a poll. That should come up on your screens just about now. So it's either you've been interested in learning a bit more about the process, you've currently been suspended, or in the previous years you've been suspended. You're a concerned relative, worried about a friend or colleague, you're worried about a complaint leading to a suspension, and you know someone who has who has passed away from suicide. I'm not allowed to say committed, apparently, or experienced significant mental health problems during a suspension process. So we've got a good number. We've got about half of our viewers who have voted, so that's just past the halfway point. Please keep on voting. I'll give you another 10 seconds to vote. So that's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so thank you very much, all those that are participating. We've still got actually some more people still getting on there. So at least we've got 71% of the vote right now. So obviously majority of you, 58%, interested in learning more about the process. About 21% of you has been suspended or currently suspended. 8% of you are a concerned relative or colleague. 21% are worried about a complaint which may lead to a suspension, and 25% of you are someone who knows someone who has either tried suicide or suicidal attempts or experienced significant mental health problems during a process. So thank you very much for participating in that. So what we're going to do now is go to Jenny, we're going to start off with Jenny, who's going to really show us a really powerful presentation, and then we're going to proceed to a panel discussion. So Jenny, let me know, and let me know when to change in the slides. Okay. So welcome.
So just so everybody, I suppose I come from the extreme end, but because of course there are very few gross negligence manslaughter prosecutions per year. They do start off in the first instance with usually a tragic event, a death, and then that can cause the doctor to be suspended pending the investigation, or they're not suspended, they're still under suspicion. And what I'd like to tell you about is, if you can get things right at the beginning and know what your rights are and know what to do and what not to do, you can usually avoid any of the awful consequences of things going wrong if you're just mindful of things from the beginning. So I'm hoping to give you some very practical help, but bear in mind, just like Crime Watch, don't have nightmares. Most of the cases will never end in a criminal prosecution, and unfortunately, because of the publicity more recently, I think it's even less likely so. So if I could have the next slide, please. What I'd like to do, you'll hear now, these are the words of Hadiza bawa-garba, and they are not spoken by her, but they are about how she felt when this whole case of Jack Adcock blew up. And I thought you'd like to hear from how she felt at first hand, although they're not spoken by her directly. Can't hear any sound. No. Oh, yeah.
And the feeling of being treated like a criminal. The nightmares and anxiety stopped when the police informed me that the case will be closed after the first interview. They returned during the inquest when I became the focus of the media, and the inquest was adjourned pending reopening of police and CPS investigation. The process of investigation in GNM takes years to resolve, and without effective coping mechanisms and support, one will run the risk of suffering a nervous breakdown, as the process can be overwhelming. Doctors have limited experience in dealing with questions from the prosecution team and can incriminate themselves in trying to answer questions. Criminalising doctors who make mistakes does not make it safer for patients. Instead, it makes us defensive and may actually negatively affect patient safety. We will be careful at how much we disclose when writing statements after a serious incident. And if we are worried about the consequences of fully admitting our mistakes, then the root cause of most clinical incidents will never be found. Most of the focus shifts onto how they are to prevent themselves from getting to a criminal court, as opposed to how they can help the coroner understand what actually happened in a case. This leads to a lack of transparency and hinders the process of learning from medical error.
So Hadiza was questioned by police. She'd had a baby at the time for 7 hours. When she was convicted, she was placed in handcuffs, placed in the cells. As you know, she didn't go to jail. But I think the whole thing was completely horrific for her. And of course, the Adcock family themselves suffered a tragedy. And I think one has to ask themselves at the end of all of this, how on earth does this help anybody learn, stop these things happening again if these completely tragic incidents destroy a doctor's career and destroy them psychologically as well. So that's the kind of thing we want to avoid, really. Next slide, please. And that's why actually I'm campaigning for a much better, more transparent process, and not just a random process, which is what seems to happen, and almost the targeting of a specific kind of person. I mean, here, this is a cartoon that we can all laugh at, but actually it makes a very serious point, because I believe there are some individuals who are more vulnerable to this, and not just minority ethnic doctors, also people who have the kind of personality that blames themselves, takes on extra work, doesn't necessarily ask for help because they think they should be getting on with it. You know, we're a broad church in medicine. We should have, it shouldn't be down to your personality that you end up in a particularly awful situation. But actually that is part of it. And part of it, there does seem to be a very worrying trend in that in the last 10 years, it's really only been minority ethnic doctors who, black and ethnic minority doctors who have been convicted of this charge. You know, that's extraordinary, but it's the absolute truth. So we need, I'm not saying these that juries are racist or anything like that, because the numbers are too small. You can't possibly allege that, or even, you know, the GMC or the CPS. But you have to at least say to yourself, can we please stop what's going on and understand why this is happening? And if we cannot demonstrate that it's fair, then we shouldn't be doing it. Next slide, please. If you look at some of the cases, and just be aware that this is the rare end of the spectrum. In the last 10 years, it's probably only every couple of years that a doctor is convicted. There's quite a number of times when you look at it, and it really is an error trap. You know, you're set up to fail. Many of you will probably be aware of the vincristine cases where it's been injected intrathecally. And a lot of these cases were happening worldwide, and there were several prosecutions before the system was finally fixed. And actually, if they'd actually tried to fix the system so that it didn't happen again, then patients wouldn't have died. But instead of that, they blamed doctors. And you know, there were 2 doctors convicted that was overturned on appeal on one of these deaths. That just shows that you should be fixing the problem, not the blame. And in this country, we've gone to let's just fix the blame at the moment. Now, the next quote that you can see on my slide, again, that's from Hadiza bawa-garba's trial. Look at this of what's said. There were clearly multiple system issues contributing to the tragic outcome. And this isn't her saying this. This is her supervisor, actually. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying this. He says, I've got real concerns about the impact of this case on my specialty. So paediatrics, obviously. Reflective practice was used. I mean, although her e-portfolio wasn't introduced to the trial, it's abundantly clear that some of the notes that she signed 5 days after Jack's death were actually part of the consultant's evidence. It was pinned to his witness statement, and cross-examination of him did occur in the witness box. So, you know, and then these were reflections that she'd made on the incident. Only, of course, when she did those reflections, she had no idea, and to be fair, neither did he, that down the line there would be a manslaughter prosecution. And this makes an important point that I'll touch on at the end, and that is that if you are involved in a serious untoward incident of any kind, particularly if it is involved in a death, just be very careful about what you write down, who you're showing that to, clear it with your defence union. If you're going to meetings, you know, make sure you're going with somebody else. so that you're protecting yourself, because unfortunately all of the information is disclosable down the line to a criminal court. And if you look here in court, the jury was simply blocked from hearing about improvements that were put in place. So after tragically Jack died, any of the improvements that the hospital saw necessary to do as a result, the jury didn't hear about. I don't think, it's my opinion, that's really not a fair way to actually assess a doctor's all the errors that happened on the day. You've got to give the jury the whole picture, and then all you end up with is a tragedy of people not reflecting and operating defensive medicine. Next slide, please. So the other work, a lot of my work is I survey doctors about how they what they think about criminalisation in healthcare, and I've got several active surveys which you may have seen at the moment. But always the most interesting part of the surveys is what people say in the comment boxes, and they're all anonymous surveys, so people say exactly what they think. And here they're being asked to comment on what they think the impact of criminal law in healthcare, what it's done to it. And here they're saying, people are organising extra tests. They're not doing, GPs, for example, are not doing minor surgery, which they would have done a few years ago. People are saying that could have been me. They're withdrawing from stuff. Everybody thinks this is all very extreme. And also hiding things. If you're a hospital trust, certainly in David Sellu's case, it's not a secret. It's been in the press that one has to look at his actions, but what happened in the hospital that day and hospital errors, they have not all come out, and yet he was made to take the blame of the whole thing. There were certain reports which were not disclosed, so that's very concerning. You would expect that your hospital, your healthcare system would behave in a neutral way. Everybody tells me, certainly from the survey I've done and my experience of the cases, that is not necessarily the case, and that's very scary. Next slide, please. Again, there's further comments here about trainees saying, why would I take the risk? A very big concern are high-risk specialties like anaesthetists, obs and gynae, paediatrics. They've already got severe recruitment problems. If you've got a charge that seems to be almost exclusively active, not completely, but when children die or young women die, you're more likely to get G&M charges, because if you look at the range of cases, there does seem to be more of a hue and cry when children die. You're not going to get many people wanting to do paediatrics, because although it's rare, again, people are saying, especially after Hadiza's case, that could be me. And people know that over the last few years, conditions have become a lot more challenging in hospitals. People are having to cover rota gaps. We know all of that. So that's why this has all happened. Next slide.
Sorry, Jenny, what's a GNM? Just for the...
gross negligence manslaughter.
Okay, brilliant.
That's the charge that Hadiza and David Sellu were convicted of. So we've talked about the consequences. We all know about defensive medicine. When I've done my 90% of doctors are saying they're organising more tests than they know patients need. They're worried about other people hiding their errors. If something happens and it's the last person holding the hand grenade, other people might hide their errors. If someone is singled out, it's better to try and blame one person. And that's what happens in the courtroom. What the prosecution try and do is they aggregate all the blame onto one person or another person if they can, the person who's charged. And everyone else who's also made errors, because they're not actually on trial, their errors are kind of minimised, and the jury don't really appreciate the significance of their errors because they're not on trial. So what will happen as a result of all of this? Well, doctors will withdraw their goodwill. A lot of the cases that you see, people have just been trying to help. They pushed themselves to put a patient on the end of the list. They've stayed late when they were tired. They've got low staffing, but despite that, when you remember, everybody knows that Hadiza was covering for another registrar. There wasn't obvious, there was a consultant on the end of the telephone until 4:30 that day, but there wasn't easily a consultant available for her to call on. And she was getting on with the job, and look what happened to her. So the concern from all of us is that no one's going to be around in the future to look after high risk patients unless we sort this out. Next slide, please. So where are the solutions? Because I know this all sounds pretty bad, and many of you have obviously got stories, horrendous stories that I'm sure you're aware of and that you could tell. But where this kind of ends, well, it's for our defence organisation, they need to, help us up their game. We need to keep detailed contemporary records. I think there needs to be a culture change in the NHS where fairness and transparency is promoted above blaming and shaming. That's all part of developing a just culture where actually people on the front line, doctors and nurses on the front line, they're not punished when things go wrong. If things go wrong, they actually have to learn from those errors, because that's the only way you make things safer. And if we are going to have a duty of candour and be honest about errors, which I believe in, that shouldn't then mean that someone is again punished for declaring those errors. And that has to be individuals and an organisation, not just an individual. It has to be honesty from the hospital trust as well. Next slide. So Abane has asked me to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour here about the process and what you can expect. If something goes wrong, let's say, for example, there is a tragic death that you're involved in, there will be a local trust investigation, and that is mandatory. It has to be done within 60 days. Root cause analysis, it should be no blame. It should look at neutrally at everybody's part, and there is then a report which should be seen by everybody. This can form part of a serious untoward incident report where there are learning processes that then may be also reported to various official bodies like the CQC and beyond. If there are concerns about a doctor's practice, that may go to the GMC, and it doesn't, it usually doesn't result in a fitness to practice hearing, but it could do. If there's a death, there may well be a coroner's inquest, and you would be called to give evidence for that. And what happened in David Sellou's and Hadiza Garba's case, which is still very rare and unusual, but what happened was the coroner suspected that a crime was committed once they'd heard their evidence. Then they can stop the inquest and call the police and ask them to investigate. Now, in a significant proportion of those cases, the police will come back and say, no, there is not. They will then talk to the police, will then liaise with the Crown Prosecution Service. And if there isn't a case sufficient that would, mandate them there isn't enough evidence for them to charge the doctor or nurse with gross negligence manslaughter, it'll then go back to the inquest. So the inquest will then be reopened. But, all the time there's a poor doctor or nurse who's sitting here, because that takes ages. You may be suspended, you are being de-skilled, because some of these inquiries, they can take at least a year. Meanwhile, you could be suspended from work and being dismissed. So the impact on us is extraordinary, even if it doesn't amount to anything. And then even after that, you could still end up going back to the GMC and being investigated. Because remember, that's exactly what happened to David Sellou. He went to prison after this was a criminal charge. He then had an appeal once he was out in prison, which got rid of the conviction. And then the GMC levelled 11 charges against him, every single one of which was thrown out last week. So he's gone to prison.
So thanks a lot, Jenny. Sorry to interrupt you there. Yeah. I just wanted to kind of go on to some of our other panellists. Yeah. As Jenny quite rightly has highlighted, amongst a lot of things that she's been quite right about, these processes go on for years. Yeah. Tony, I mean, you've had a relatively recent experience. Can you comment on the whistle stop tour and how that impacted on you, the duration?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, it's one of the worst experiences that anybody can wish to go through. It's something which always comes from out of the blue. You never expect it. One of the things which is worth mentioning is that when the GMC look at a current complaint, they can go back historically and look at up to 7 years of complaints against you. So, depending on where you work in general practice, you tend to get complaints that come through, which are usually quite low level, but they can go back through there. They look for patterns of behavior. So everything that you're doing today, you might not even think about it, but it can come back to bite you in 6-7 years' time. With that, I think, comes a huge level of anxiety from us as doctors, healthcare professionals, because you're trying to do the best. Every day, none of us goes into work with any malicious intent. I think the workload gets on top of us. I think that the kind of pressure mounts every day. And, whenever you have that situation, you're going to end up spreading yourself a bit more thinly, and that's when mistakes happen. And it doesn't necessarily have to end up in a manslaughter charge. I guess that's what Jenny was saying, that this is the kind of that end of the scale. But even on the more kind of trivial things, they can pick up on anything. And my experience is that the GMC, well, if I can go back a step, the medical defense organizations, we pay pretty hefty subs to them. And unfortunately, my experience has been that, they tend to offer as much help as they can, but there comes a point when they won't offer any help past that. As an example, without getting into the details of my case, but, my barrister said that there was, grounds for a Crown Court kind of case to take it, as high up as it could go to the High Court. And my medical defense organization at that time said no, because we're responsible for all of the members' kind of monies, and that isn't an adequate or an appropriate use of members' funds. Now, obviously, if you had a private barrister, they would go absolutely all out for you, but then that's going to cost you a lot. I mean, the estimate of these kind of cases can be anything from £10,000-20,000 right the way up to the hundreds of thousands of pounds. So I guess that is a real problem. And what I've noticed is the medical defense organizations year on year increase their subs, but what do we actually get for that? Not a great deal. And some of their education sessions are good, but I found a lot of them are very generic stuff, which we all know anyway. And they move from shiny building to shiny building, and unfortunately we don't get that service on the back of it.
Pamela, I mean, you've worked with several doctors over the years, and from your own experience, how long do these cases tend to last?
How long is a piece of string? The longest was 13 years.
Wow.
That's pretty historic. And after that, there were some legislation changes. But that lady died only recently.
So are there legislation that actually dictates the maximum time that a doctor can go through this procedure?
It was rather before my time, but I know that that one hit the headlines, and they either put pressure on the NHS boards or actually changed the legislation. I'm not quite sure, but I don't think there's ever been anything quite as long, although it can be many years. Trusts don't care about timing. They will give you impossible deadlines, like they knew I was on sick leave. 4 days before I went in for my hysterectomy, they gave me an offer and said, would you like to consider this before your sick leave?
But do you think this is strategic on their part, or is it just poor time management?
No, this is deliberate. They don't care.
It's deliberate. It's absolutely deliberate.
Why?
Absolutely deliberate. It's part of the whole tactic to wear you down. And of course, Jenny already mentioned de-skilling. I mean, in technical specialties, a few months and you can be de-skilled.
I might as well actually give some questions relating to what's been discussed so far. So, Tony, you mentioned that there was a limit to what the MDMPS could do, and said actually it's in the best interest of our cash funds that we don't support you anymore.
Add something on that. Sorry. Can I just add, everyone should know your membership of all defence unions is discretionary.
Yes.
They can drop you like a hot brick anytime they like without giving you any explanation. You're causing them too much trouble. That's in their articles of association. I've actually looked it up, the Scottish one.
So, I mean, Tony, when you get to a point where they drop you, what do you do? Or you drop them? How do you know when that point is?
Well, it didn't. Yeah, do you know what? It's all case by case, Bainer. There isn't really any strategy for it. But as doctors, we do our day job. What we don't know is how any of this system works. Where at the behest of whichever solicitor or barrister you end up getting, they choose at short notice. Solicitors, barristers can change. So I've had probably 2 different solicitors and 2 or 3 different barristers during my dealings with the MPS in this case that I'm talking about, and it's been, it has been very, very difficult at times. When you do end up with a good one, obviously you're very grateful and you understand why you pay that subscription. But the truth is that there is always this. It almost feels sometimes that everyone is in kind of a cahoot. And you're just not part of it. You're the victim in it all, and everyone else seems to be making the decisions around you. What would be really, really helpful is if the doctor who was who the complaint was made against was actually involved in the decision process from the start. But all of that being said, I think the thing for me is that the GMC they tend to go for the maximum possible sanction, even if it's seems completely, if it seems disproportionate to what the crime or the complaint is, they always seem to go for that. That's not just my experience, that's everybody who I've spoken to who's been through similar. And you're made to feel like you've done something wrong way before, any kind of decision has been made. There's definitely no, innocent until proven guilty.
So we actually don't have that much time left, considering what we were covering. But let's go to our do's and don'ts, because we did touch upon that. If you find yourself in this situation.
So sorry, just quickly, because I spoke a long time at the beginning. So just very quickly, just be aware of anything you write down. It could be used against you in any future investigation. So unfortunately, we're subject to multiple jeopardy. So, serious untoward incident reports, anything you say under coroners, anything can be disclosed. Don't hide errors. None of us willfully does that, but try and be honest and transparent about your errors, but try not to blame yourself either. And I would check with your defence unit before submitting any kind of statement, at however basic an investigation level it is, because remember, that's still disclosable if the case escalated further down and you just don't know whether it will or not. Be careful, have some red flashing off if there's an under-resourced situation with no staff. We do care towards our patients, but just be careful. Both David and Hadiza helped when there were under-resourced situations. David was very tired at the end of the day and doing his best. Just be careful of that. Don't overstretch yourself, because you will get the blame. The way the GMC says it is, what's in good medical practice, it's your responsibility if there was a high-risk situation. So that brings me on to the final point, is to be...
Actually, can I just quickly ask you about the withdrawal of goodwill? So as you know, especially in the Hadiza case, she had a choice in inverted commas whether to work or not to work in those very difficult situations. And then the GMC released some guidance saying if you do get into that situation, you can't refuse not to work, but please follow this very long flow chart and report it to various people. I mean, what are your thoughts on that in those very difficult situations that most of us face on a day-to-day basis?
Well, let me tell you, when Hadiza got in that morning, the first thing she had to deal with was an arrest of a child. She had no time to ring human resources, say, oh dear, there's a new registrar that's covered up because she covered to do this. She wasn't even supposed to be working on that ward, on the acute paediatric ward. And yet in the court, they blamed her and said, well, because you didn't phone human resources, it's your fault because you didn't alert them and say that you couldn't cope. Hadiza went and resuscitated the child. She saved numerous lives that day. Look what happened to her. So just the whole thing is basically unfair. No, you can't withdraw your goodwill, but what you've got to do is you've got to highlight all of those, alert somebody in management, and also try and put it in writing as well. So send off a very quick email. Now, how you're supposed to do that and attend paediatric arrests and do everything else she was trying to do. But essentially, that's what the GMC was saying.
They're superheroes, remember?
Which is crazy, but that's what you have to do.
Tony, have you got any comments for do's and don'ts from your personal?
Yeah, I mean, so there are so many, and part of my work at the moment, like I said at the beginning, is about bringing together a resource for doctors who can't work for whatever reason. And, you know, there'll be a lot of detail in that, and that will come through PHP in the next few weeks, you know, a couple of months, let's say. So do look out for that. But what I would say is that, you know, you've got to document everything, like forensically document everything, because that's your only record. And if you're, you know, if you have a conversation with the GMC, write it in an email, confirm it back to them. If you have a conversation with your MPS, MDU, MDDUS, document it, make sure that you keep that record, because all of this will come back. And, you know, it's just as simple as on my kind of NHS email folder, I've got a separate section which is all to do with my complaint, and everything's inside there. So chronologically, if anything ever needs to be looked at, I can just go back and look. I think otherwise you just don't have, so you've got to be well organized, you know. And I think that you've got to make sure that from a professional point of view, you keep in touch with the GMC. I know they're the ones who are putting you through this, but actually to have a good relationship with your case review worker is a useful thing to have, because they can obviously offer advice on, you know, thing, you know, like anything which might come up, whether there's another part or they need some more information or a new form needs filling in. They're the people to go through. Keep in touch with your MPS. Make sure you contact your local NHS, whether it's CCG as a GP, whether it's Foundation Trust, Hospital Trust. If you're a secondary care doctor, you've got to make sure that you keep everybody in the loop and make sure you look after yourself. I mean, going to see your GP, going to see occupational health, use all available resources. I know sometimes it feels like a bit of a strain to do that, but actually it's maintaining, well, first of all, it's making you, you know, look good in the eyes, you know, that you're using the resources that are available to you. And also it actually does help. I mean, you know, certainly I find that speaking to people who aren't involved in, you know, the situation is often quite a therapeutic thing. So I think that's important too. The other side of it, which we've barely touched upon, is the financial side of it. And the financial side of it is so difficult because we're not very good.
That, Tony, so I will ask you specifically about that. But Pamela, have you got anything else to add to that list of do's and don'ts?
I think on a more basic level, I mean, I've no experience with the GMC, thankfully, but meetings with trusts, I know that trust minutes are edited, erroneous, let's say, and not worth the paper they're printed on. So take your own minutes, take somebody with you and present them to the trust, and if they don't challenge them within 14 days, they stand as a record of the meeting. That's a useful tip, but always take a scribe with you. Be perfectly honest, say, this person is a friend, all they are here for is to try. Don't be covert, don't start doing covert recording or stuff like that. Just get somebody to write it down for you.
Thank you, Pamela. Okay, so we've got to move on to the well-being issue, which Tony did touch upon. So, Tony, I mean, you obviously work with PHP like I do. Can you give us an overview of what that involves and what other services are you aware of that supports doctors independently who are going through this process?
Do you know, there are so many to kind of go through. I mean, if I can just say, I think definitely register with, you know, people like PHP. There's also the doctor support group based in Wimbledon who, you know, you should register with. You should also register with, you know, a GP if you haven't already, somebody who can help you through the more kind of psychological and emotional side of it, because it is quite a draining process. I think from a financial point of view, there's lots of things like the Cameron Fund, the Royal Medical Benevolent Fund, you know, and you know, organisations like them. You know, if you do a search on any search engine, they will come up, and they're definitely worth applying to. My own experience is personally that I got rejected by them, but that's partly because of, you know, they come and see what your financial situation is, and they say, okay, you've got enough savings to survive, and move on to somebody else. But these are all these things are available to us, and I think it's very, very important to use them. The GMC also recommend the BMA support service. I've been in touch with them, not a huge amount, but
what's that called? Is that Doctors for Doctors?
So yes, yeah, exactly. So it's funded by the BMA.
Okay. How about so actually someone's commented in the chat box, PHP rejected me as I was in IMG. Do they not support IMGs? International graduates, that is?
I think as long as no, as far as I'm aware, they do. I think if you are working as a doctor anywhere, I mean, until recently, PHP didn't get the contract for nationally until recently, but now they're national. So they did have a thing where you could only, if you had to be registered within the M25 or working within the M25. I think that was the key. But I think now they've gone national. No, there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no kind of restriction like that. I'm not sure how long ago that was, but I'll certainly, be willing to take.
Yeah, why don't we highlight that? Tony said it was 2 years ago, so I'll look into it again. Okay. So cheers. Fine. Pamela, so tell us more about the Doctor Support Group.
Well, the Doctor Support Group dates from 1985, but we need to go back further than that because it's not an independent organisation. It is a subgroup, a study group of the Society of Clinical Psychiatrists. And the Society of Clinical Psychiatrists set up this study group in 1985 because they were worried about the number of suicides among suspended doctors, so it's not a new problem. They produced 3 very detailed reports. We have sent data to the National Audit Office on at least 2 occasions. The issue has been discussed in both houses of Parliament over the years. And the network that we set up through the help of the Society of Clinical Psychiatrists meant that we managed, anybody that was referred to us, we managed to prevent all suicides amongst that group. Sadly, there were some who weren't referred, but the number of suicides did fall. And that was one of the main reasons why the support group was set up.
So can you give us an idea of what the support group looks like today in practice?
In practice now, sadly, well, the problem is the Society of Clinical Psychiatrists has lost its power, lost its membership, and is a shadow of its former self. So we no longer have the psychiatric support. It is still in existence, but only just. The Doctors Support Group has a very active website set up by our late webmaster, Dr. David Vineker, who died suddenly in October last year. There is a tremendous resource on that and on the website of the Society of Clinical Psychiatrists. And the Doctors Support Group meet every 6 to 7 weeks on a Sunday afternoon in the Priory Hospital, Roehampton. And any doctors are welcome to that. Normally, they refer themselves through a contact form on the website, and we know they're coming, but if someone finds us on the day, they can just turn up. Our meetings are advertised. Meetings run for about 3 or 4 hours and open. Everyone has a chance to present a new case, and then after that, there's general discussion of other issues and older cases.
So what's the rationale behind the actual groups? Is this like group therapy, and what do doctors generally get out of that experience?
Advice, experienced advice from the older members there. Guidance. We don't recommend, like we can't recommend lawyers, but we can tell people about lawyers who have helped other people and leave the decision to them.
So in many ways, it's like a non-judgmental, open community.
Avoid
knowledge.
What to avoid in terms of mistake, in terms of maybe not documenting things, not having your case neatly organized. Try to prevent people taking radical action against trusts and being hot-headed, and trying to modify that, and sometimes telling them that they have to play along with the processes, especially with the GMC, if that looks likely to come to a good conclusion.
So
advisory and support.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. It's only we've got 10 minutes left, and I know that Jenny needs to leave at 8 even. So I just wanted to quickly go on to income. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. So as Tony's also mentioned earlier, one of the issues is during suspension. Sometimes you're partially suspended. There's certain things that you can and can't do. From your experience, let's go back to Jenny. What kind of things are doctors doing if they're suspended? How do they maintain their income, pay the bills?
Well, I think that's actually not so much an area of my expertise. I can tell you what David did. He was, he was basically at home. He wasn't able to work. Once they charged him with gross negligence, he wasn't able to work after that. But that's different from a suspension. Once I think probably that would be better to hand over to Tony to answer that from the financial side of things. Can you comment on that, Tony? I think you'd be better than me.
Yeah, sure. So, again, it completely depends upon kind of what type of employment you've got. Obviously, if you're a locum, the agency won't cover you as a general rule. If you're salaried, it depends upon the what your job is. So a hospital trust will usually cover you for X number of months. It depends upon your length of service with them, and then you go down to nothing. If you are a GP, a salaried GP, you will lose your job. They won't really take care of any financial problems. If you're a partner, you're at the behest of the partnership agreement that you've signed. So partnership can expel you at any point for this kind of thing. It's a fairly normal clause to have in a partnership agreement. When that happens, now I think they might have closed that window, but when it happened to me, you suddenly lose, a good income, and it's very difficult to get employment back after that, because obviously, when you're writing on your CV, you've got to declare it. And, I guess I was lucky in lots of ways that I had good contacts in the area. So after my suspension, I got back to work, and, the rest is kind of history. But there are lots of people who, even after suspension's lifted and there was nothing that they did wrong, they still can't find work because they've always got this kind of shadow following them.
So as you know, one of the things you specialise in is alternative careers. So things that you can do, maybe not as a GMC registered doctor. So what kind of things, you were talking to me earlier about other things that potentially doctors have done and can do.
Yeah, so we've actually written to the GMC as part of this piece of work that we're doing at the moment to ask them exactly that question. They've still not responded to us. I imagine it's not very high up on their priority list at the moment. But basically, we need to know, is there work that, because don't forget, as doctors, we tend to pigeonhole ourselves into a certain, whether it's a GP, hospital doctor, occupational health doctor. And the problem is that we actually have a skill set that is useful far beyond that. It's just that we've been so conditioned to do what we do on a daily basis. We don't have necessarily the confidence or the exposure to look for the things. So there's plenty of jobs that are out there. This kind of jobs from things like health consulting. You can be a management consultant. You can go into anything. You've got a fantastic, kind of 5-year degree, and so there's no reason why you can't do something else. The problem is that we work so hard to get to a certain point that we feel like it's a waste if we pick medicine, and that's a common theme that you see in doctors and healthcare professionals who've been through this kind of process. Is that they think, well, what else can I do?
I think it's also important to remember, just to touch upon that, is that doctors have a wide range of transferable skills, highly qualified, highly valuable to pretty much anyone in society, and that goes beyond having a GMC number. And I think it's really important for everyone to remember that. Especially if you are in a challenging situation, you literally have no clue what to do. I mean, on our website, we have a whole range of things that potentially you could do, but it could literally start, depending on the relationship that you have with your employer, start with working in the office and doing management stuff and, you know, not touching patients, to, I don't know, going and advising, as you mentioned, for a company. And, you know, on top of that, there's other ways to earn income, especially with the internet these days, from, you know, property investment, you name it. It's so broad, I couldn't really give you a list. But I would say it is important, even if you're concerned and, you know, and nothing's happened to you yet, but you're not really sure what would happen if it happened. It's always important to have that either in your head or have a second form of income, basically, you know, a backup plan, because as you heard from today, that you know, things can fall apart and you need to have a plan B or C. So before Jenny goes, I really wanted to just cover some of these. There's lots of questions coming through in the Q&A section. Where do I start with this? So let me just so someone said, what career paths and jobs are open to suspended doctors? Any financial support? Can they claim benefits? So do doctors have too much money to claim benefits? Is that the general byline of the situation or not?
Anyway, get it. Well, having worked in the benefits service for 9 years, I'll take this one. I think generally anybody a few years into medicine would not be eligible for benefits unless due to injury or something. But you know, some targeted very young doctors might just come into it, but I think that's the only thing. But I was finding it a little confusing during that discussion whether we're talking about suspension from trusts or suspension from GMC, because one obviously automatic loss of income. Suspension from the trust should not affect your income.
I think that's really important too. There's so many different reasons why you could be suspended, right?
Yeah, but more and more.
Yeah, and also, you know, the level of the complaint as well, don't forget, is you know, makes a big difference. So obviously, if you're somebody who's got a low-level complaint, yes, you could go in and work in the management side of it. Perhaps you could, you know, as a GP surgery, you could come in and do some of the quaff work. But if it's something more high-level, then unfortunately, I think you'll find it more difficult to go and do that kind of work.
So theoretically speaking, if you were suspended from a trust, could you go and work for a private healthcare company if you hadn't had any GMC involvement?
No. Well, remember, you've got a full-time contract with that trust.
Anyone.
I think.
Yeah, so I'm not an employment lawyer. I don't know the exact ins and outs of that. It would be wrong for me to give any concrete advice, but I would imagine that if you're suspended from working for a hospital trust with whom you hold a contract, then I'm not sure that it would be looked upon favourably if you then went and worked privately.
Yeah, usually so I can talk about this from my experience with David. I mean, usually if you are in trouble at your NHS or seen, you know, you're having troubles at your NHS, that you won't be able to work in the private sector because they will rely on your NHS, you know, record, and they will look at that, and then they won't give you practicing privileges. So it all plays into another, and you're denied an income on both sides.
Okay, so we've got another question saying, do we know how percentage of doctors have been investigated, referred and suspended after they whistleblow rather than after a clinical incident? And if this is high, what can be done about it? I don't know if Jenny knows the answer to that.
I don't. I think Chris Day would know the answer to that. I don't know about the percentage of. I bet he'd have an on-the-spot answer for that. I wouldn't be able to tell you what the answer was for that was. No. Good question.
I couldn't tell you a percentage, but I couldn't tell you a percentage for it, but I could say that, you know, the problem here is that it needs a completely attitudinal shift to whistleblowing. All trusts have a whistleblowing policy, which is really just just to cover their own backs. In reality, what happens is that if you whistleblow, the chances are you're not going to be in a job for long, you know, and they usually suspend both parties during that process. You know, any junior doctor out there knows that from the very start, you respect your seniors, and seniors are the ones who have the decisions. And so a lot of people just don't feel comfortable. Even, they can't just refer to whistleblowing policy and say, oh, well, now I feel really comfortable to go and, whistleblow my consultant. They just wouldn't do that. Like, people think, I'm in this job for 4 months, I need to get a reference out of it. Why am I going to ruffle the feathers?
Yeah, no, definitely. Sorry, moving on to another question. So post-suspension, I'm trying to get back to practice as a GP. I'm struggling to get indemnity via the 3 major defence organisations, and NHS England is asking me to get unfair cover, and private insurers are asking a huge amount. How do I get indemnity in such a situation where the defence organisations have declined cover? Thank you.
I'll take this one to begin with, I suppose. Very, very difficult. Very difficult. I think what you've got to do is you've got to be willing to pay the extra amount for the for the duration of that suspension, and just take that on the chin, because if you think of it from the defence organisation's point of view, they see you as a risk, and they're responsible for thousands of doctors' subscriptions, and that's the way they look at it. That if we take this doctor on, what's the likelihood of getting another complaint like this? I think that it's very tricky. I think that what's happening as well, already the MDU has reduced its fees, but what you'll find is that people can't sustain that level of kind of expenditure. People are paying 10% of their income.
Actually, that is a good question. So is there any evidence to show that doctors who have been referred to the GMC are higher risk than those that haven't been referred? So are they like re-offenders? Are they more likely to be re-offenders?
It's almost a moot point, Abena, because it's a bit like if you have a criminal record and you apply for a job, are you going to give it to somebody with a criminal record or somebody without? Like, once the complaints come in, the damage is done. It doesn't really matter. I mean,
so it's one strike and you're out, and then you're high risk to the defence organisation, rather than your one strike, it's sorted.
Like, imagine this: if your case costs £100,000 to the MPS, and then you go to the MDU, they're going to look at you and think, well, you're a bigger risk, or they might wipe their brow and say, well, thank God we didn't have you 3 years ago. That's essentially the way that these organisations look at it. But I think there's now increasing pressure, on these organisations to reduce their subscriptions, because people can't afford to spend 10-12% of their gross income, to get this kind of defence, kind of organisation. It's very, very difficult. So I think my advice to the person who asked that question is, it's going to be hard. I think you've got to be willing to pay the extra in the short term, and then with a clean record, you should be able to get it again in the future.
I mean, you mentioned that you got a private barrister. Is that the best way forward? At what point do you realise that that's probably
some of these people, they charge £400 an hour, and there's very little you can get done in 1 hour with a barrister. These things very quickly spiral up into tens of thousands of pounds. I think you've got to be very careful when you're looking at doing something privately funded.
Okay.
The advice we give at the group about using private lawyers is do as much of the work as you can yourself. Prepare your case for them and just use them for their opinions. And that way you can save the cost. You do the legwork for them. Very often they'll want all kinds of information that you can collate, send to them, summarize for them, this sort of thing.
That's right, because I concur with that, because for David Sellou's appeal, that wasn't funded at the beginning by the insurance. So we had to raise £50,000 to kickstart David's appeal, which was an extraordinary sum of money. And at the beginning, we didn't know it was going to cost that much, but our barrister cost £450 an hour, and we just had to keep going. And I acted as the solicitor and just got all the pieces of information to save them time, because literally the clock was ticking on every email. That's how you get charged. It is possible to do it, but that's where David had lots of friends raising that kind of money. But if you haven't got those resources, you're shut out of that kind of thing. And he would never have got his appeal if we hadn't been able to raise that money at the beginning.
It seems to be the same case with
Society,
Bawa-garba, isn't it?
Sorry?
It seems to be the same case with Dr. Bawa-garba having raised over 350k.
Well, it's slightly different because there, what happened was there was never any question that the Medical Protection Society weren't going to. They paid for all her trial lawyers, and then they were considering whether they would pay. They didn't say no to that, but in the meantime, such an extraordinary sum of money was raised. I think she then made her own decision. With David, the problem we had there was that the Defence Society felt that because they'd instructed the original trial lawyers, that they had some loyalty to them, and we had to obviously get an independent lawyer because we were looking at an appeal, and during appeals you could end up criticising the people who represented the defendant at trial. So we were out on a limb having to support that appeal at the beginning, and if he hadn't had that, he would never have had his conviction overturned. So it was in the end the Insurance Society did come back on board, but we had to kick the whole thing off at the beginning because, again, I think Tony referred to the fact that it's all discretionary. If they don't want to fund what your idea is at the beginning, if they don't agree that, you know, that's where they want to put their money, they don't have to. And you just are left out and you have to get on with it yourself.
Thank you, Jenny. Do you have to go now, or you can stay for another 5 minutes?
I can stay for another 5 minutes, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So another question from your experience, this is to the whole panel, what is the percentage of suspended doctors who actually go back to work?
I don't know the answer.
I've got no idea about the
Pamela?
It's low. 10-20%. Depends what you mean by going back to work. They may go back, but may change their area of work, move within a trust, and certainly one case that just ended up in the person involved being a victim again. She wasn't suspended again, but nearly killed her over work because they knew she couldn't answer back. But no, for a lot of people, they're very damaged and it's very difficult to work again in a team, and there can be the risk of a second suspension then, because you're sort of almost playing the victim role.
I mean, Tony, thanks a lot, Pamela, for that. I mean, Tony, you obviously went back to work after suspension under supervision. I mean, what was your confidence like, and how have you developed, how have you built that up over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends on your prior experience as well, doesn't it? Like, if this happened to me when I was a junior doctor, I'd have been absolutely broken, I think. I mean, it's really hard. But, I mean, I was, you know, I count myself as a fortunate person. I don't think anything that I did, I could have been, kind of dealt a different hand and had a different lawyer on that day, and who wouldn't have perhaps been as vocal. Who knows? But the point is that I've got back to work, and for me, I think that you're always watching your back. Like, you're absolutely right what you said earlier about practicing defensive medicine. We all have to do it now, and it's something that grates me. But equally, I'd rather take that hit and practice defensively. I think that going back to what Pamela said, what people forget is that we are people first and foremost. We're not just doctors. We're people, and these decisions that these organizations make are very, very have very grave consequences for people. Whether you talk about suicide, whether you talk about going bankrupt, whether you talk about none of these things obviously happen to me, but from my experience and people who I've met through PHP, this is a common thing that happens. People, I think the profession has forgotten that fundamentally we're people first and then doctors second.
Yeah, I know people do forget that we are human beings with hearts and lives and loves, and actually went into medicine to actually support and help a whole load of people, and mistakes happen. Like, we're not bad people. But I think it's been over criminalized, and I think something really drastically needs to change. Either that, or they prepare us all for what could happen, and at least we will be informed as to what the consequences of choosing this profession could be, because I don't think many of us are aware until it happens to us.
Quick point, if I might. we're looking at the doctor in isolation, one other point we make is that the doctor has a family.
Mm-hmm.
And any decision on the future must be what's best for the whole family.
Mm.
Whether the spouse, the kids can cope with this stressful profession, that may influence it. And, you know, the health and family should be the doctor's.
Very important. That's very important. I'm going to have to go due to the family, but thank you for inviting me.
No, that's absolutely fine. We'll be
I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from taking part in this webinar myself. Because I ended up with health problems at the end of David's appeal, and I'm not working at the moment. I'm hoping to go back to work, but it was just when you're talking about stress and the effect on us, we are all human, and you know, all of these things cause stress, and that can then cause serious, in my case, a serious physical illness. So, you know, as doctors, we pay a high price to go in and just serve our patients, or put wrong things, in David's case, right again. So all of us are human, and we often end up paying a very high cost, not just career, it can be physical, can be mental health.
Yeah.
Anyway, so good night, and
thank you very much.
Get well soon.
Thank you very much, Jenny. So Jenny, if anyone has any questions for you, wants to get hold of you, how can they do so?
Through my website,
which is
on the slides. Okay, manslaughter and healthcare. If they type in manslaughter and healthcare.
Okay, brilliant. So I mean, everyone here will get a recording today anyway, so you can always go back and take a look at that, but we can also send that to you via email. So quickly before we finish, let's just do another quick poll. So we've just done one on what in your opinion, what more can be done to support doctors through this process? So again, so the options are, you know, institutions taking more responsibility, independent online resources available, provision of dedicated mental health support from a specific person, a national independent body designed to support doctors through suspension. So really similar to the doctor support group, but national. Just simply talk about it more, get rid of the taboo, more robust policies on supporting doctors through suspensions, or ensure that there are absolute time restrictions on the suspension process, whether it's trust level, local level, you know, national level, GMC. Make sure that is definitely adhered to under law. So I'll give you another 10 seconds to complete that. We can use this information, can't we, Tony?
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. So nearly done. So we give you a few more seconds. Most of you have voted now. Yeah, so 80% have voted, but I'm going to close it right now. So the vast majority said a national independent body designed to support doctors through suspensions, and that was 83% of you. The second highest was an absolute time restriction on the suspensions process, which I completely agree with. And the third highest was more robust policies on supporting doctors through suspensions. So thank you very much for everyone for participating in that. So just to let you know about some of our upcoming events. So as I said, this recording will be available to everyone that has joined today and those that have registered. If you want to see us in person to talk about alternative careers, we'll have at Deloitte next week. Otherwise, we're doing more webinars this year than we ever have before, because we realise we're based in London, but we want to reach as many doctors as possible, which actually goes beyond the UK. You'd be surprised. We have people from Canada, US, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, India, all over. So these are all relevant to doctors across the world, and problems with doctors, mental well-being, health, careers, they're not unique to the UK, I can promise you that. It's an epidemic. So the webinars that we have coming up include something about management consultancy, financial education for doctors. So, you know, earning income is one thing and knowing what to do with it is another. This is something that I actually more advice on. And then we will be covering addictions in doctors. So we have some psychiatrists and doctors who are specialists in that, because as you know, addictions is actually more common than we think amongst our profession. Aesthetics, so that is a possible alternative form of income, and then working in the Middle East. So if you want to find out more information about anything that we do and our website, please feel free to go to medicfootprints.org. I'm very sorry that we weren't able to address every single question, but if you do have anything, please feel free. How do people get hold of you, Pamela and Tony?
Email is usually best for me.
Myself through the Doctors Support Group, Doctors Support Group website, and go to contact us, and that goes to me and another senior member of the Doctors Support Group. Okay,
brilliant. Sorry, Tony, you were saying?
Yeah, for me, it's probably my email address, tony.banerjee@nhs.net, or you can contact me via PHP as well.
Okay, thank you both. And just sorry?
I can stay and answer some of these questions if you'd like me to.
Oh, okay, brilliant. So Pamela?
I can stay for a bit as well, yeah.
Great, okay, great. So please feel free to stay, everyone. We're going to answer your questions. So I'll go through them in order. So someone asked, what can you do if your GP finds you fit to return to work, but your employer is not facilitating the return?
Sorry, can you just repeat that?
What can you do if your GP has signed you fit to return to work, but your employer is not facilitating the return? I mean, I could answer that. I'm not a occupational health doctor.
Yeah, I mean, this is really, really common. I think that what you need to do is you need to remember that your doctor has, an obligation to listen to you. Your employer doesn't. And so what you often find is that your employer will take that note and they'll do with it what they want to. I mean, it's not necessarily right, but probably the best advice to do would be to get somebody to take a look from occupational health or from employment law and just see independently if that stands reasonable.
I think bottom line, it's your employer's decision whether to sign you back. Yeah, I mean, your employer is the final decision maker. They're not obliged to take you back to work, and it's up to you as to where you want to take that. Usually it goes to an employment tribunal or beyond, depending on the reasons.
But the problem is that an employment tribunal can rule that you go back to work and the trust will still block it.
Mm-hmm.
The trust will block everything if they're so disposed.
Yeah. So the next question, are these investigations deliberately extended to undermine the doctor and therefore cause de-skilling?
Yes.
I mean, it's so difficult to kind of give an answer. I mean, all I know is that when you're on the receiving end, yes. I mean, it's a really difficult process to go through. You do sometimes feel that they do, make it as uncomfortable as they possibly can. They do things very last minute, drop in, kind of references or, kind of witness statements at the last, the 11th hour. Unfortunately, I don't think that is, you can always take things personally. I think that's just the way that they work, if I'm honest. I think they've got that many cases to go through, complaints arising year on year, and I think that is unfortunately the way that they do. However, that is a positive from a defense point of view, because from a defense point of view, you can say, well, you've dropped this in at the last minute, and if you've got a good employment, if you've got a good solicitor or a barrister, they can use that to their advantage as well.
So next question, my cardiac surgeon who did my complex bypass operation was suspended and finally struck off by the GMC. There are no cardiac surgeons who are willing to operate on high-risk cardiac patients, and that's at a hospital in Birmingham. I'm not sure if that is an actual question.
Yeah.
Any comments on that?
I mean, it's very worrying, isn't it, really? This is what goes back to what we were saying. People will always practice defensively. And why would I put myself at increased risk for no reason?
Defensive medicine is one of the most popular specialties these days. I don't think they're having any problems recruiting.
Yeah.
So the next one. Sorry, go on, Pamela.
Can I give you a quick anecdote? Someone who was pushing the boundaries of interventional radiology many years ago, literally pulling clots out, etc., was suspended and the next week called back because he was the only person that could save this man's life.
And so what happened at the end of that? I mean, once you'd done the procedure, was it covered to do that, or
Yeah.
was he allowed to continue practicing with them?
I don't know what happened to him eventually. He lost contact with the group.
Because actually, apparently, when we had a discussion, you said that those who are working innovatively are high risk for suspension because they're pushing the boundaries in their practice. Is that correct?
Yes. That's a group that are now being targeted.
And that's quite interesting, considering the kind of but explosion of innovation, particularly within the NHS. So it's just something that doctors need to really be considering. Whether it's to do with patients or not, there is a high chance of complaints coming through.
Yeah.
Sorry.
People don't understand. People don't understand what they're trying to do because it's so innovative. And there may only be 4 or 5 people in the country doing it.
So do most complaints tend to come from employers or patients or elsewhere?
Employers. Definitely. Very, very few suspensions in my experience are patient initiated complaints.
Why do you think it's such a large number?
Bullying managers, bullying colleagues, personality clashes. Used to be turf wars in private practice. I think that's less of a case now. People pushing the boundaries, of people perceiving someone as a threat. And then, of course, there's the whole question of discrimination of any kind.
Okay, next question. I went off sick due to pregnancy-related illness, and my trust has reported me to GMC, blaming me for threatening patients' treatment and having to travel further. How can I defend myself?
Gosh, can you just repeat the first bit?
So this person went off sick due to pregnancy-related illness,
Yeah.
and the trust has reported them to the GMC, blaming me for threatening patients' treatment and having to travel further. I mean, from an occupational health perspective, depending on the real nature of why they've reported you to the GMC, which sounds ridiculous, well, on the surface, but I don't know the details.
Yeah.
It sounds.
I think there's a lot missing from that story, isn't there?
Expect them to actually deal with it locally. But considering, if it really was a pregnancy-related illness, you should have at least have occupational health input to confirm that. But even so, there is a risk of discrimination when it comes to anything pregnancy-related, as you know. But you really obviously you need to speak to your union about that.
Yeah, you've got to speak.
It sounds quite dodgy, generally.
I mean, you've got to speak to union. It's like that's a very brief bit of information about what's actually happened. I think you need to know more about the case, but definitely your union is the first person. If you don't get the answer that you want, then you have to go and see an employment lawyer.
And this was related to another question which I've actually forgotten, but someone said, where can I find this process to get my career? I'm not sure what that was referring to, unfortunately. But the next one, my suspension is now revoked. I'm trying to get back to practice as a GP. I'm struggling to get indemnity via the 3 major defence organisations in NHS England. Maybe we answered this question.
Yeah, I think we answered it.
We did ask them this question. When suspended, how can one maintain their skills, appraisals and CPD eventually essential for GMC's revalidation?
Go to as many meetings as possible, do online courses, go, if you have colleagues in other parts of the country and you can go and observe or get as much exposure to the medical world in whatever way you can, using the contact you've got.
Yeah, run everything by the GMC first. So everything that you do, run it by the GMC. I think that, you've got to get their clearance first in order to do anything. I personally, what I did in my 5 months off was attended as many CPD courses as possible that were relevant. I went to, seminars. I went to, these educational events that the kind of hospitals organise. There's nothing to stop you going to those. There's nothing kind of, patient facing in those meetings. I think try try and create as good an impression of yourself as you possibly can, because obviously that will stand you in good stead when it comes to your review.
Okay, thank you. So the GMC imposed strict conditions on my. Did I ask this question as well? About GMC imposed strict conditions on my registration 3 years ago, encountering difficulties ever since with finding work, how to go back to work as a consultant, because no one is able to supervise me in order to have conditions lifted. Supervision is required by the GMC. What should I do?
Well, there has to be provision there. I mean, depends how wide you want to sling that net. There will definitely be supervision that's available for consultants. It may mean moving trust. It may mean moving area. It depends how important the work is to that person. But once the suspension is lifted, there's absolutely no reason why you can't go back to work. There will be a process to do that. You'll have to kind of accrue various, first of all, go through clinical observership perhaps, and then gradually reintegrate yourself back into the work. But no, once your suspension is lifted, there's no reason why you can't work.
What are the implications for whoever decides that they can supervise you? Why would consultants refuse or not be willing to do so?
I suppose who has the time? That's the kind of crux of it. So if you're working a 5-day week, where do you fit in the supervision of another consultant? I think that needs to be done from trust level, to be honest with you. They have to if they want to take that consultant back, or if they're interested in that consultant coming to work for them, they have to find the time and the space for somebody to act in that supervisory role.
Okay. So next one, someone was making a comment. I will close that one. I just went back to work. However, when I was several months into the post, my former responsible officer reported me to the GMC for inverted commas misconduct. Again, right. Not really a question.
No.
Difficult to answer that without the information.
Don't know enough.
So bearing in mind that the GMC has enacted these draconian measures in the last few years, and the number of people who have died during the processes, had this been a clinical trial, would their approach have been abandoned many years ago?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone's asked, how do we register for upcoming webinars? So if you go on our website, there's a list of all our upcoming events. Some of them aren't on there already, so the addiction one isn't listed yet, but we'll do. So if you're on our mailing list, we will let you know when that's ready. Why are the doctors made the scapegoats for bullying and for such treatment? Do we need to be more politically active to get our voice heard so that the power balance can start to be worked on? Yes, totally.
Yeah.
This is what Medic Footprints is about. It's about empowering doctors. I think we've lost our autonomy, we've lost our voice, we've lost our community.
Yeah.
You just have to look at.
We end up as victims.
But if you look at the organisations that are supporting us, though, Abena, I mean, the BMA, you just have to look at the junior doctors contracts and how that went. If you're represented by a toothless tiger, then unfortunately you're not going to get the bite that you want, and this is the problem that you often see, that the organizations are in cahoots. That's what I was trying to get at before.
Yeah, exactly. GMC and the BMA they work very closely together. They've got that history.
Yeah, they're not independent bodies, and
exactly.
In the same way, the MPTS and the GMC are not independent bodies, they're both closely intertwined.
Yeah, and maybe that is the problem, that these are very closely intertwined, interdependent. I mean, I know, in Wales, the BMA and the GMC were in the same building.
Yeah,
working together, which I was actually quite surprised about, but not at the same time. The people that work these, they're all genuinely nice people, but I just think there's a conflict of interest there when it comes to representing people's interests. I know that's why a lot of people have loss of confidence in both bodies.
Yeah, I'll have to sign off now, I'm afraid.
Okay, we have come to the end of our questions now. Again, thank you everyone, and our panelists, most importantly, for sharing their experiences and wisdom. And we will be sharing this recording with those who are registered. If you think this would be useful for anyone to watch, please feel free to share that with them. And if you do have any concerns about yourself, then please get in touch and we'll put you in touch with the right person. And thank you very much. It's our pleasure for setting this up. It needed to be done. So I hope you have a great evening and enjoy your meals. And thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.